Hi, and welcome to our frontline training on serving and working with Indigenous clients who have been impacted by the collateral consequences of justice involvement. In this first video, we'll explore the foundational aspects of Indigenous leadership and governance, the importance of consensus building, crucial language and concepts, and the vital role of friendship centers in urban Indigenous communities. This information will be crucial as we'll explore the collateral consequences of justice involvement for Indigenous peoples and how the deep and complex histories impact the barriers and experiences of Indigenous people in the justice system. Let's get started. Indigenous peoples have maintained their ways of self-governing since time immemorial. Indigenous governance systems are not about a hierarchical approach to leadership, but one that is based on supporting community needs through consensus. Consensus building is rooted in respect and situational leadership, which is essential for decision-making that meets the whole community's needs. Every member of an Indigenous community has a role and responsibility in this, from the prenatal stages to elders, and this collective involvement supports the well-being of the community. Traditional governance structures play a significant role in maintaining community balance and harmony. Let's look at a few examples. 7 clan system. The clan system operated as a form of government and a way to organize work. Each clan, symbolized by its totem animal, defined the responsibilities of each community member to work together to address the physical, intellectual, psychological, and spiritual needs of the community. The buffalo hunt was a system designed to manage and regulate the communal hunting of buffalo. Elders and leaders came together to make decisions to ensure the sustainable and respectful hunting of buffalo, dividing up roles among community members to effectively hunt and preserve buffalo populations. The Haudenosaunee Circle Wampum. The equal strands of wampum represent unity and equality among 50 chiefs, with the single, longer strand representing the people. The 50 chiefs are said to be holding hands, creating a large circle. And when we are born, our heart is in the middle. Inside the circle are the ways of the Haudenosaunee, the laws and customs of the people, their language, ceremonies, culture, and way of life. This circle symbolizes the unity and shared responsibility of leadership under the chief's protection as they continue the ways of the Haudenosaunee, looking ahead 7 generations when making their decisions. This is something you can keep in mind when working with your clients. Think about how you can apply the teachings of the circle, sharing responsibilities, understanding someone's past, and looking beyond the short term to promote greater individual connection to decisions and holistic support. In the spirit world, we choose our parents because we have lessons to learn and because they prepared for 2 years, offering tobacco and preparing for new life. Before we even come to this community, we have responsibilities and gifts which may change as we move through life, but which we are given to us long before we were in our physical bodies. And our original instructions are to be grateful, as we have been given everything we need to live a good life. All beings would continue to thrive if humans did not exist, being nourished by the animals and plants that continue to fulfill their responsibilities. Each stage of life comes with unique responsibilities. Infants bring joy to the world and teach people how to be happy. Toddlers teach others about safety, which is why families put everything dangerous out of reach. Children have the responsibility of truth, constantly asking why and teaching people to carefully consider what truth is. Youth and young adults are responsible for disrupting the status quo, challenging truths, but also doing the work of the people as helpers and young leaders. Adults and parents have the responsibility to nurture and provide, grandparents to teach about life, and elders to teach about spirit and give spiritual guidance. At every stage of life, community is there to support, nurture, and guide each other in fulfilling these responsibilities. These values are integrated into the foundation of the Friendship Center movement that began in the late 1950s as a result of amendments made to the Indian Act in 1951. The Indian Act is a piece of legislation passed in 1876 which still governs the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples today. Its original goal was to force the assimilation of the Indigenous people through the reservation system, residential school mandates, deeming who could receive status, and through the banning of ceremony. Much of this power was given to the Department of Indian Affairs, now known as the Department of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, and the Indian Agent. The Indian Agent was a person who carried out the policies and tasks of the Indian Act. Some of these included being a representative on reserves, regulating who can leave and enter the reserves, deeming who could receive status, as well as forcibly taking children to residential schools. While many amendments were made to the Indian Act in the later 20th century to return rights to the Indigenous peoples, like the right to vote, the right to not lose status for marrying a non-Indigenous person, as well as the unbanning of ceremony, the Indian Act remains a controversial piece of legislation today, as it does not give Indigenous peoples across Canada the sovereignty over their own communities and peoples, and because of the loss of status and its impacts, continues to perpetuate a lack of recognition of the urban Indigenous population. However, these amendments did also lead to changes in the community. For example, when the Indian Act dissolved the role of the Indian Agent in the 1960s, this led many Indigenous peoples to leave the reserve. They did so for a number of reasons, like building a better life, gaining higher education, seeking employment, or reuniting with family already living in urban and rural areas. Moving off the reserve and not being accustomed to Western ways of doing things, Indigenous peoples, most often Indigenous women, would gather around the kitchen table for a tea and talk, where they can share resources and offer. These tea and talks grew into cultural community centers and evolved into what we now know as friendship centers, status-blind, non-profit organizations which provide wraparound services through various programs and supports to urban Indigenous communities. The centers also grew out of necessity, with urban Indigenous communities falling outside of the government's approach to Indigenous people. Friendship centers grew to fill the gap, ensuring the urban Indigenous communities had access to their own supports. Today, the centers, which are open to everyone, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, create space for Indigenous communities to thrive. They act as idea incubators for young Indigenous people looking to attain their education and employment goals, as sites for cultural resurgence for families who want to raise their children proud of who they are, and as safe havens for community members requiring supports. They deliver a range of holistic, culture-based, educational, and social programs and initiatives that respond to the needs of tens of thousands of community members. They are crucial to the health of so many Indigenous urban communities, delivering services from a place of cultural empowerment and safety, which dramatically enhances the community's access to the services. The centers, established in Kenora, Thunder Bay, Toronto, London, Parry Sound, and Red Lake, are called the Original Six, but the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers, incorporated in 1971, now represents the collective interests of 31 member friendship centers across Ontario. As part of your work, you should find out where the local friendship center closest to you is, so that you can build up a relationship and connection with them. Learn more about their individual programs and supports and how you can work together to promote greater success for all. The Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres also engages in research, policy, social programs, advocacy, and a broad range of training and evaluation, building up the strengths, capacity, and resiliencies of urban Indigenous communities. Part of these trainings includes understandings on the definitions of Indigenous peoples. These definitions are complex, as there are various forms of definitions. Some are cultural understandings of self-identity that are grounded in family ancestry, traditions, and community practices, and some are based in law and legislation. Indigenous people may use terms like Indian, Indigenous, or Aboriginal to identify themselves as part of a larger collective identity that has been shaped by a common history of colonialism and European settlement. But it's important to know that some of these words are imposed and do not reflect the diverse cultural traditions of Indigenous people. Let's take a look at some of these words. The word Indigenous is a term to describe Aboriginal peoples in an international context or within Indigenous rights movements. Even though this term is not derived from traditional Indigenous practices or languages, it is still a term that many Indigenous people have fought to define. The term Aboriginal, on the other hand, is one that was used in Canadian Constitution to acknowledge Aboriginal rights. According to the Constitution's definition, this term included 3 groups defined as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Métis, defined by the Métis National Council, is a term to define a person who self-identifies as Métis, is distinct from other Indigenous peoples, is of historic Métis ancestry, and is accepted by the Métis Nation provincially. Members of the Métis Nation share a common cultural, ancestral language, history, and political traditions. Inuit is a term derived from Inuktitut, meaning for the people, and refers broadly to the Arctic Indigenous peoples of northern Canada, Alaska, and Greenland. Most of the Inuit population live in 51 communities spanning 4 regions, from Inuit Nunavut, which is the land, water, and ice contained in the Arctic region, and the Inuvialuit settlement region in the Northwest Territories, to Nunavut and Nunavik in northern Quebec, to Nunatsiavut in northern Labrador. First Nations is a term used to refer to the various Indigenous peoples who are neither Métis nor Inuit. Most, but not all, reserve-based communities in Canada refer to themselves as First Nations. And while the term First Nations can be used when collectively referring to reserve-based communities, it's best to use the name of that community or First Nation when making a specific reference to a community. The term status Indian refers to a specific legal term used in the Indian Act, and one which was used to regulate and restrict who can be legally identified as an Indian. Conversely, a non-status Indian are people who consider themselves Indian. However, they face challenges from being legislated out of their communities with an inability to participate in band politics or be eligible for the same rights and supports the government offers to status Indians. Historically, status Indians would lose their status if they acquired an education, became a professional like a doctor or a lawyer, served in the army, left the reserve for long periods, or if an Indian woman married a non-Indian man. Still today, Indian status has resulted in many people being ineligible for legal recognition as Indian by the government. Finally, the term urban Indigenous peoples refer to any Indigenous people who lives off reserve in rural or urban areas. In Ontario, 88% of Indigenous peoples live in urban or rural areas and would be considered urban Indigenous peoples. However, it's important to recognize the distinctions and diversity within these communities, as outlined in the previous definitions, and understand the many unique issues that the urban Indigenous populations face. By understanding how identity is created and defined, one can begin to see the implications of these definitions in policy, legislation, and mainstream conceptions, and their impacts on the day-to-day experiences of Indigenous peoples. And we'll learn a little bit more about this in the next module.